At my sister Sophia's wedding, my mother Isabel raised her champagne glass, her eyes glistening under the Napa Valley sunset. She scanned the lavish reception filled with Boston's elite, her gaze sweeping right past me as if I were just part of the hired staff. Her voice, clear and proud, echoed through the silent vineyard. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, her smile fixed on my perfect sister, "to the daughter, who truly gave us everything." The crowd erupted in applause. Sophia smirked at me from the head table, a queen surveying her victory. They had no idea that the real price of everything was my entire soul, and I was about to deliver the final invoice, right in front of everyone. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ava, and on the morning of my sister Sophia's wedding, I was on my hands and knees in the damp chill of our family's wine cellar. A critical temperature gauge had failed overnight, and I was desperately trying to salvage the barrels of Liqueur d'Or, the signature Chardonnay that was not just our legacy, but my life's work. I remembered my grandfather showing me this very spot years ago, his rough hands explaining how the cool, steady earth was the vineyard's heartbeat. "You feel that, Ava," he'd said, his eyes serious. "That's the soul of the wine. Never trade it for anything." He had also warned me, in his quiet way, about my father's tendency to look for easy solutions. "Your father is a good man, but he fears failure more than he loves this land. Be watchful." Now, that soul felt like it was failing, and I was the only one there to notice. The scent of damp earth and aging oak was my entire world, a stark contrast to the faint sounds of laughter and classical music drifting down from the main house, where the real celebration was already underway. Upstairs, my sister was being treated like a queen. Down here, I was the forgotten serf, working to ensure the props for her grand performance were perfect. For months, I had been watching the signs of decay. The suppliers we'd used for decades were being replaced by cheaper, less reliable ones. The old oak barrels my grandfather swore by were cracking. And my father, Henry, had refused my request to invest in new ones, citing cash flow issues. He'd dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand, more interested in the floral arrangements for the wedding than the foundational health of our vineyard. Just last week, Miguel, our head vintner who had worked alongside my grandfather, pulled me aside with worry etched on his face. "Ava," he'd said in a low voice, "your father is cutting corners that have no corners to cut. This isn't business, it's sacrilege." His words had echoed my own unspoken fears. My father eventually appeared at the top of the stone steps, his figure silhouetted against the bright morning light. He wasn't there to help, he was there to hurry me along, his face a mask of strained anxiety. As he turned to leave, a single sheet of paper slipped from the thick manila folder tucked under his arm, fluttering down into a dark corner he didn't notice. After he was gone, I picked it up. The paper was cold and official, the letterhead of a major bank printed at the top. My eyes scanned the dense text until they landed on a phrase that made the seller's chill seep directly into my bones. "Final notice of foreclosure." The date of seizure was scheduled for the day after the wedding. It wasn't a shock, so much as a confirmation of 100 tiny fears I'd been suppressing for the last year. I finally understood. The lavish ceremony, the designer dress, the hundreds of guests, it was all a beautifully orchestrated lie. A final, desperate gamble before the house of cards came crashing down. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily in my stomach as I cleaned myself up and went upstairs before I could even reach my room. Sophia intercepted me, holding out her phone. "Ava, be a dear and drive into town. Would you? The hotel's Evian is from last season's bottling, and I simply must have the latest. It's for my complexion." It was a 40-minute round trip for bottled water, a task designed solely to remind me of my place. As I passed the bridal suite later, she swept out, her face a mask of theatrical frustration. "Ava, can you believe it? The peonies are blush. Not shell pink, it's a disaster. She barely glanced at my dirt-stained jeans, her world so consumed by floral shades that she couldn't see the abyss opening up beneath us. I just nodded, the absurdity of it all leaving me speechless. The scene in her room was exactly as I'd imagined. My mother, Isabel, was fussing over the train of Sophia's extravagant gown while my sister preened in front of a full-length mirror, a diamond necklace from her fiancé, Julian Croft, sparkling at her throat. They were discussing the merits of a penthouse in San Francisco versus a summer home in the Hamptons, as if the ground beneath our feet wasn't about to crumble. My mother finally noticed me lingering in the doorway. She handed me a simple, off-the-rack bridesmaid dress, the fabric feeling cheap and thin in my hands. "Just try to blend in, dear," she said, her tone implying that my very presence was a potential disruption to her carefully crafted illusion. The message was clear: I was a background player, a necessary but inconvenient part of the scenery. My only role was to not draw focus from the star of the show. Fueled by a cold, quiet anger, I made an excuse about finding a special vintage for the toast and slipped into my father's office. The foreclosure notice had been a symptom. I needed to understand the disease. On his desk, my gaze fell on a silver frame holding a photo of my father beaming with pride next to Sophia in her cap and gown at her Ivy League graduation. I wasn't in the picture. I had been harvesting that weekend. A choice I was made to feel was a dereliction of family duty. The same manila folder lay on his antique desk. It wasn't a loan document. It was a draft of a merger and acquisition agreement between our failing vineyard and the massive Croft Corporation. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding with each legal clause. Then I saw it, a section titled Personal Guarantee. My father had signed away everything. He had pledged his remaining personal assets, including our family home, as collateral against undisclosed debts within the vineyard. He wasn't just selling a company, he was betting his entire existence on this marriage, turning himself into a human insurance policy for the Croft family. He was ensuring that if the ship went down, he would be the only one to drown. Just as I placed the folder down, my father walked in. He saw the document in my hands, and his face went pale. He didn't get angry, he just looked defeated. "Ava, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "This is for the family?" His plea, meant to sound noble, felt like a betrayal of everything my grandfather had stood for. But I knew there had to be more. As I left the office, I passed my parents' study, where I heard their hushed, tense voices. "It's the only way, Henry," my mother insisted, her voice sharp. "She'll have a life we could only dream of. This is for the family." I knew she meant Sophia. I had long ago ceased to be a factor in her definition of family. I knew where the real secrets were kept, in the oldest part of the cellar. Behind a false wall my grandfather had built was his original ledger, a thick, leather-bound book that chronicled the true history of our family, warts and all. That evening, while the rest of the family entertained the Crofts at the rehearsal dinner, I made my way into the hidden vault from a small window. I could see the dinner party on the terrace. I saw Julian's father, a man with eyes like chips of ice, watching my own father as he laughed a little too loudly, a little too desperately. It wasn't a look of camaraderie. It was the look of a predator assessing its prey. The ledger confirmed my fears, detailing years of hidden losses and foolish investments. Next to it was a small wooden box containing my grandmother's tarnished silver locket, a reminder of a legacy built on love, not leveraged buyouts. Tucked inside the back cover of the ledger was another, newer leather portfolio. It was the final signed version of the merger agreement, ready to be executed the moment Sophia and Julian said "I do." I turned the pages, my hands trembling slightly, until I reached the final addendum. It was titled Appendix C, Intangible Assets. There was only one item listed. It read the proprietary formula and cultivation methodology for the Liqueur Doré Chardonnay varietal, an intellectual property developed by Ava, to be transferred in perpetuity for the symbolic sum of $1. They were selling my soul. The years I had spent perfecting the grape, the sleepless nights during harvest, the unique fermentation process I had pioneered my entire identity. distilled into a single line item and sold for less than a bottle of cheap wine. I sank to the floor, the cold stones seeping through my clothes. I felt a hollow ache spread through my chest. It wasn't just a business transaction, it was an erasure of my entire existence within the family. Later that night, Sophia found me walking through the darkened rows of vines, the place I always went for solace. "There you are," she said, her voice sharp, not with concern, but with accusation. "What is wrong with you? Ava, you've been moping around all day. This is my wedding. Can't you at least pretend to be happy for me, I looked at her, at the sister who had shared my childhood, but not my life. "Is that what this is about? Sophia, your happiness?" She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Of course it is. Just because your life is stuck in the dirt doesn't mean you have to drag mine down with you. Some of us are meant for bigger things." The chasm between us had never felt wider. She saw my life's passion as dirt, and her marriage as an escape to bigger things. There was nothing left to say. The wedding day was a blur of forced smiles. While getting ready, Sophia, holding a glass of champagne, stumbled near me, accidentally spilling the sticky liquid down the front of my simple dress. "Oh, clumsy me," she chirped, without a hint of remorse. My mother sighed dramatically and found an old, ill-fitting dress from a back closet for me, making me feel even more like an unwelcome guest. The wedding planner, a woman named Claire, saw the whole exchange. She later found me alone, handing me a warm cup of tea. "You have more grace than this whole family combined," she said softly, a small act of kindness that felt monumental. Before the ceremony, as I was doing a final check on the wine service, Julian found me. "The liqueur d'or is exceptional," he said, his voice sincere. "You have a real gift, Ava." His simple, direct praise was so foreign, so unlike the conditional approval I was used to, that it almost brought me to tears. He saw me, the real me, in a way my own family never had. I stood beside my sister at the altar. Watching her recite vows she didn't mean to a man who saw her as a beautiful acquisition. During the officiant's speech, my eyes met my father's. I saw a flicker of profound shame in his gaze before he quickly looked down at his shoes. He knew. He knew what he was sacrificing. After the ceremony, during the family photos, the photographer, clearly taking direction from my mother, arranged various groupings. When it came to a shot of the core family, he paused, looked at me, and said, "Could you step out for this one, please? We just want the parents with the bride and groom." The public dismissal, in front of dozens of watching guests, was a fresh, sharp sting of humiliation. At the reception, I was seated at a table near the back. A kind, distant aunt I hadn't seen in years sat beside me for a moment. "Why aren't you at the head table, dear?" she whispered, patting my hand. "You're the heart of this place. None of this would be here without you. Your grandfather would be so proud of the wine, but so disappointed in this spectacle." Her words were a small balm on a gaping wound. I watched my family laugh and toast. Sophia stood to give her own toast, a shimmering, shallow speech about finding her prince and how she couldn't wait to start their adventure together, peppering it with references to the Croft family's yacht and their winter home in Aspen. It was a performance of love, but the script was all about money. My father gave a speech about tradition and family, his voice thick with false emotion. Then my mother stood, her silver dress shimmering in the candlelight. She looked directly at Sophia, her smile radiant. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, her voice ringing with triumph, "to the daughter who truly gave us everything." As the applause began, I felt a wave of nausea. For a fleeting second, I almost let it go. But then I looked at the Croft family, at Julian's trusting face, and I thought of my grandfather's warning. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the truth. I stood up. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up the professionally bound document I had prepared overnight and walked calmly toward the head table. The room quieted, conversations trailing off as all eyes turned to me. I didn't look at my mother or my sister. My focus was on Julian and his father. I reached their table and, In the deafening silence, placed the open document directly in front of them. It contained just 3 pages. The first was the foreclosure notice from the bank. The second was the page from my grandfather's ledger showing the true catastrophic state of our finances. The third and final page was Appendix C, with the clause about my life's work being sold for $1 highlighted in yellow. I met Julian's gaze for a brief second, then turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving the evidence to speak for itself. I didn't stay to watch the fallout, but I could feel it behind me, a wave of shocked silence followed by the first angry murmurs. I imagined the scene Julian's father, his icy composure finally cracking as he read the truth. Julian, his face a canvas of disbelief and betrayal. My mother's smile freezing, then crumbling into rage. My father shrinking in his chair, a man undone. I walked out of the reception, past the rows of luxury cars, and got into my own beat-up truck. I drove to a hill overlooking the vineyard, the place my grandfather used to take me to watch the sunrise. I watched as the music stopped abruptly and the warm, festive lights of the party began to blink out, one by one, in the chaos below. I didn't cry. I just watched my old life extinguish itself. I didn't answer the frantic calls from my father or read the venomous texts from my mother. I just drove, leaving the Napa Valley and the ruins of my family behind me. 6 months later, I was working at a small cooperative winery in Oregon. My life was simple, quiet, and honest. One evening, I received a rambling, tearful voicemail from Sophia. She was working as a receptionist, her voice dripping with resentment. "You ruined my life. Ava, I could have had everything. Do you know what it's like to actually work for a living?" Her complete lack of self-awareness was almost comical. A few weeks after that, I received a call from an unknown number. It was my father. He wasn't at the vineyard. He was calling from a motel. His voice was hollow. "I left. Ava," he said. "I left your mother. I see it all now. What I let her do, what I let myself become. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I needed you to know." It wasn't an apology, but it was a confession, and in its own way, it was a start. One afternoon, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my small apartment. Inside were legal documents, professionally prepared and stamped. Julian Croft had used his considerable influence to extricate the Liqueur d'Or formula from his family's now defunct deal and the subsequent bankruptcy proceedings of my family's vineyard. The final page was a deed of intellectual property, officially and irrevocably assigning sole ownership to me. Tucked inside was a handwritten note from Julian. It said only one thing: "This was never theirs to give. It was always yours." A month later, another package arrived. It was from my distant aunt. Inside was my grandmother's silver locket and a short note. "Your grandfather would have wanted you to have this. He always said you were the true heir." Holding the cool metal in my hand, I sat down at my small kitchen table. I took out a clean sheet of paper and, for the first time in a long time, began to sketch out a design for a new wine label. It wasn't my family's crest. It was a single, resilient grapevine, growing strong and free. I knew my new life had truly begun. A year after the wedding, I received another unexpected call. It was Miguel, our old head vintner. He had also left after the foreclosure, refusing to work under the new corporate ownership. "I heard you're in Oregon," he said, his voice warm. "Some of the old crew are up here too. We were wondering if you ever decided to start something new. We'd be honored to work the land with you again." The offer, a testament to a loyalty I thought I had lost, was the final piece of my healing. The family I had lost was one of blood, but the family I was building was one of shared respect and a love for the soil.